Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about an aspect of the archetype of the mother that has been termed the death mother. And that is, as I said, the negative side that we're all very well acquainted with through fairy tales such as Hansel and Gretel and the archetype of the witch. And there are others as well, like Medusa. Of that part of the feminine, of the maternal, that we perceive and experience as killing psychic energy, shutting us down, turning us off. The part of the mother archetype, whether it comes from a teacher or some other figures in one's life, that elicits in us feelings of anxiety, emotional hunger, shame, dread, all kinds of things. It's part of the mother archetype. It certainly is part of many an individual's history of relational emotional trauma. And there is quite a bit of material and people have spoken about it. So with all that said, let's begin to understand this incredibly influential force in our lives.
You know, it might make sense to take a minute and differentiate the death mother from the negative mother, because we have talked about that before. In a sense, they're very close together, and perhaps the death mother is like a category of negative mother, but it's a very specific phenomenon because it has to do with a situation or an energy in which that from which we expect nurture behaves in such a way as to threaten our lives. And this could be an actual biological mother, but it could also be with something else that's supposed to be mothering in the environment, whether it's an institution or an organization, another kind of relationship, or even just the nature of nature itself. Because nature is that great mother that both gives birth to life and also destroys and kills. So at its bedrock, the death mother is part of life itself.
Marie-Louise von Franz is the first, I believe, to coin that term, and that shows up in her book, The Interpretation of Fairy Tales. And I'll just read this particular paragraph from the book so we can kind of place it in that initial imaginative world. And from that, other authors have gleaned much more beyond that. So this will take a minute or two to read her whole quote. Oh, the sun myth and the tree myth are connected, for in the morning the sun is born in the east out of the tree. Therefore, for instance, the Christmas tree and every Christmas the tree gives birth to the new light at the moment of the winter solstice. So all the sun myths are in a way also tree myths. But then the tree is also a mother. You know that in Saxony, even now it is said that beautiful girls grow under the leaves of trees, and I could show you pictures showing that children come from trees. The souls of unborn children rustle under the leaves, and that is why there are trees in the center of all German, Austrian, and Swiss villages. The tree is therefore the great mother. But the tree is not only the mother of life, but also the death mother, because from trees coffins are made, and there are tree burials. the shamans of circumpolar tribes and people in certain North Canadian tribes are buried in a tree. Probably also the Babylonian ziggurats, and these columns on which the Persians put their dead are a travesty of the tree. So the idea of the tree burial, that the body of the tree is then transformed into the coffin, is a link that von Franz makes and also has older resonances to it, including a Kabbalistic idea, so I think I'll bring up in a bit. So von Franz coins this term just through the observation of burial rites and myths and the similitude of various images and mythologies.
So this idea von Franz that there's sort of the tree that gives birth and then the tree becomes the coffin speaks to the fact that this death mother energy, this death mother archetype that we're talking about is a sort of essential part of the great round, as Eric Neumann calls it. And I have a quote here by Anthony Stevens that I think is really beautiful. So this Anthony Stevens is a Jungian analyst, and he's talking about Gaia, the Earth Mother. He says her commitment to the continuation of life is central, but the commitment to any specific life is non-existent. There is an unconflicted acceptance of the value and necessity of death as an integral part of life. So if you think about it, again, if you think about it in terms of Mother Nature, she puts forth in abundance, but then she also takes away in abundance. And Mother Nature is kind of totally impartial to the life of the individual. So it was a beautiful fall weekend here in Philadelphia this past weekend, and I went to the Morris Arboretum with some of my family, and there was a monarch butterfly in a life and death struggle with some big, ugly wasp. And I have to say, we did intervene and rescue the monarch. But those kinds of things are when you see a bumblebee caught in a spider's web, and you think, the human compassion, you want to rescue the poor little bumblebee, but the spider needs to eat too. And nature herself is impartial to that struggle. It's like, well, who is the bee going to tear itself free from the web or not? Because this is just how the cookie crumbles. So the death mother energy is all around us all the time, and actually is an integral and unavoidable aspect of life.
What you're saying here really brings up the difference between our ego perspective and this great round, that Mother Nature is in service to life, but she does not provide a whole lot of attention to an individual bumblebee. Or I think what sparks reaction in us is to any single one of us.
Right.
There is such an abundance, and my image of life, and my image for this is always the salmon swimming upstream, and thousands of them return to the streams where they were spawned, and only some relatively small percentage makes it all the way upstream. And in the meantime, the fishermen are out there catching salmon. The bears are out there gorging on salmon to get them through the winter months. And it is a kind of a startling thing to think about. Are we kind of like the salmon, that there are untold numbers of us? And the message is sort of like, you're on your own. Or as my daughter calls it, yo-yo, you're on your own. And good luck with that. Swimming all the way upstream. Do the best you can. You pays your money and you takes your chances, which seems a little sort of like, oh, really, what is supporting me and my life and my becoming? Because it feels like Mother Nature is not there for us. What is there for us? So, what I'm thinking about is we've kind of at least given a quick overview of Mother Nature and that aspect of the archetype of the mother. And then we can look at mythology to see what the collective has done with this image over time. I referenced Hansel and Gretel, the lovely old lady who tells the kids that, they can help themselves to the gingerbread and the candy, only as a way, like your image of the spider, Lisa, like lure you in and it only to devour you. There's the well-known story of Medusa, who turned people to stone, and Medea, who killed her children to get back at her errant husband, Jason, who'd gone a-wandering. There are many more examples, I think, in mythology and fairy tale.
And I'd like to offer another kind of archetypal layer, that in many ancient religions, there's a great tension between force and form, or spirit and matter. And this is intrinsic to much of the Far Eastern religions, and that was also brought into Christianity through Syria, that spirit is somehow unfettered, free, without limits, and free from decay, and that all that is brought into matter is subject to all of the suffering of the material world, and illness and aging and all manner of other vicissitudes. The story of Gautama Buddha, leaving the palace and looking at death and pain and suffering that life brings. And wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a method where we could transcend suffering and also not need to incarnate again, and to escape the wheel of birth and death would be to escape the womb, because the womb is the thing that takes the spirit and enfleshes it, and subsequently subjects it to all of the struggles of being a physical being. So there's a tension theologically between spirit and matter and the whole process of incarnation. The Kabbalists take another step, which I think is helpful in our discussion, is that the light, all of the cosmic potential emanates from one aspect of the tree of life, is emanated and passed to the Divine Mother, called Binah. Binah so fully understands the potential of the spirit that she immediately predicts the succession of forms that the spirit must embody to force all of its potential to be actualized. And in that model, the form exists to facilitate the actualization of potential. And when the form has exhausted its utility, i.e., the spirit has learned all it can, the same mother principle dissolves the form, liberates the indwelling spirit, and offers the next successive form for its development. And out of that, we get this idea, which is not uncommon, that life and reincarnation is a succession of educative experiences for the soul or the spirit of the individual. So the cosmic mother provides all forms and then also dissolves those forms, or is the death mother when there is no more utility to the experience. And that's one philosophic orientation towards the same principle of embodiment and the succession of forms.
One of the things that I think comes up in everything we've been talking about is a total lack of sentimentality.
Yeah.
So that's maybe one of the defining features of the death mother, is there's nothing sentimental, which is interesting because you think about sort of our cultural conception of motherhood is just steeped in sentimentality, isn't it? And I mean, and I can tell you, I was, when I wasn't being a death mother, I was a very sentimental mother. So, that's a true part of the experience too. It's like, oh, look at this little onesie. They don't fit in it anymore. I have to give it away.
So sentimentalization and also idealization of the mother then causes this split off
Yes.
phenomena that all the other aspects of the archetype are then pushed away, but then they're vibrating under the surface. They're thrumming where nobody can see them, but they are still affecting things.
So I think, what this points to is that in our culture in the Western world, at least in this country today, we have kind of split the archetype.
Mm-hmm.
Motherhood is wonderful. It's always wonderful, all day, every day. You're going to have a first baby, you're going to have a shower and make a list of all the things you want to get at one of these great baby supply outlets. It's become very, very sentimentalized.
Mm-hmm.
And your book, Lisa, on motherhood, and any conversation anybody has ever had with the mother of an infant or toddler will include how frustrating and difficult, exhausting, and anger-making the constant demand of this infant and toddler is, in addition to being many, many shades of wonderful and adorable. But today in our culture, motherhood has been hugely sentimentalized. The negative is not really dealt with or permitted, as if these human feelings are somehow the equivalent of something related to annihilation or death.
And Deb, that's really helpful. I mean, I think you're identifying that there's this split, right? And I think that's so true because we either just totally idealize it or the other side really goes into the shadow, doesn't it? And we don't think about it, we don't talk about it. But as you said, Joseph, it's kind of knocking around. But I think that idealization of motherhood, it has this other effect too that I see where, I had someone, I think, where did this happen? I can't remember, but someone said, I love my mother and I hate my mother. And I thought, yes, it's like somehow though, an effect, I think, of idealizing motherhood is that we grow up expecting our mothers to have been perfect. Just like somehow we've been sold an image of motherhood as this kind of totally beatific experience all the time. As adults, we look back and we're like astounded that parts of our childhood or our current relationship with our mother might be disappointing or wounding. And, and I'm certainly not talking about mothers who are truly terrible or filicidal or dangerous. But your sort of average mother who has, faults and flaws and makes mistakes and, is infuriating at times. And that gets split off too. And then we're not afforded the possibility of having a sort of, reasonable expectation of this entirely human person,
So I think what I'm thinking about is that we've been honing and refining what you said earlier, Lisa, about the negative mother is not the death mother. The negative mother is that human mother who gets exhausted, who gets angry, who doesn't pay attention. You can make a great long list of all the faults that mom very definitely had. And it's our job, given what Donald Winnicott, a British psychoanalyst and pediatrician, called, we need the good enough mother, who has, from a child's point of view, negative as well as positive attributes, but overall is present, is loving, does care, and can establish with her child a secure base, a secure relational base that is at the center of that child's being, from which then we're free to kind of go and come. But the death mother takes it into a different dimension.
So I think, as Jung has said, that whenever there is a kind of archetypal disavowal, that the gods then go into the body, they go into the unconscious, they're secretly influencing. And as you were both saying, that when there is shame over natural ambivalence and occasions of hostility in a mother, and that's combined with this intense cultural idealization, that an essential part of the archetype is cut off. When an archetype is cut off and it is still active, it begins to grow in its potency and accrete all kinds of additional material. Then when it hits a critical mass, it will erupt and become a possessing dynamic. And a mother can experience herself being altered, being changed by the archetype. And if it becomes the death mother, then there are some very particular effects that it has on her as well as on her children. I would also say that our vulnerability to archetypal possession comes from many different components. Part of it could be just a natural temperament, but also structural stressors. Mom has limited resources or no social support, or she doesn't have a partner, she has lots of dependents. All of those things that chip away at our ego strength. And AA does a good job. Don't get too lonely, don't get too scared, don't get too hungry. All of the things that chew the ego down make it much more vulnerable to an archetypal possession of all kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And if the death mother is hovering close, that exhaustion and chipping away makes the mom much more vulnerable to acting out the archetypal dynamic, which may not, by the way, show up as a literal lethal actions against the children, but can create a kind of death-like energy in the relationship that causes the child to shut down and freeze up and be denied the life-giving aspects of the mother.
Yeah, I like your idea, Joseph, about it's sort of, the fact that we can be susceptible to possession, and it makes me think of to speak to actual infanticide, the famous case of Andrea Yates, who, what year was that? It was in 2001, and Anna Quinlan. So she drowned her 5 children, I think, in the bathtub. And Anna Quinlan wrote a piece in Newsweek that was called "Playing God on No Sleep." And here's a quote from that, which I just think speaks to the point you were making, that it's like a universal possibility. So here's Anna Quinlan. She says, "Every mother I've asked about the Yates case has the same reaction. She's appalled. She's aghast. And then she gets this look. And the look says that at some forbidden level, she understands. The look says that there are 2 very different kinds of horror here. There is the unimaginable idea of the killings, and then there is the entirely imaginable idea of going quietly bonkers in the house with 5 kids under the age of 7. And I think she's really, really onto something that in some sense, this is sort of a universal potential. I want to just change tracks just a little bit. And Deb, I think I'm going back to something you were saying a minute ago. Marion Woodman talked about the death mother, and she said the death mother either wants her child dead or wants a part of her child dead. And I think that this is sort of like, what is that like in the relational field, to feel like your mother wants you dead or wants part of you dead? And I go back to this thing that I just think about again and again, which is what a difference it makes to feel enjoyed. and I'll have people come in and talk about their experience in childhood, and it's not so much my mother didn't love me. I'll say, I don't think your mother enjoyed you. Sometimes when I work with young mothers and they're all upset and then, am I doing a good enough job? I'll say, do you enjoy it at least some of the time? And they'll say, yes. I said, then you're doing a great job. Because when you think about the experience of knowing that you are enjoyed, think about it now in your life. When you walk into a room and your partner, your friend, your coworkers turn to you and you can just tell, you can't fake it. They're genuinely happy to see you. It's why it feels so good to make someone laugh. It's why it feels so good to play together, because you're being enjoyed and you're enjoying the other person. There's mutual enjoyment. I mean, that's really what sex is about too. So it's such an essential glue to feel that you're cherished. And I think especially for kids, to know that your mother not just loved you, but enjoyed mothering you. You know, there's this wonderful quote. I'm going to just paraphrase it because I don't know the exact words, but Marc Chagall said of his mother, "My mother had a very difficult time with me. I think she quite enjoyed it."
That's a great quote.
Yeah, and that is the opposite of the death mother.
Right.
The death mother is, there's no enjoyment here and I want you dead.
So in the child feels that they are not wanted,
Mm-hmm.
that they are a problem. And then when the child realizes that they are not wanted, it shuts down their affect and their natural interest in exploration. And that can have a devastating effect on the child if it is repeated and chronic. As you were saying, Lisa, and Deb, you've alluded to it also, that the world's not perfect, kids aren't perfect, moms aren't perfect, life is tough. So occasionally not wanting your kids around, like, please let me go to the bathroom alone, like for 5 minutes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
18 times a day, yeah.
Right, a pervasive attitude towards a child of, I wish you weren't here ever. That changes the child's psyche.
You're both going right toward the death mother, and that dynamic is pervasive. As you just said, Joseph, it's not that flaring of exasperation that says, "Oh my God, all I wanted to do was go to the bathroom." Is that too much to ask?
Which is a reasonable frustration.
Exactly. But you can tell the difference that I'm kind of enacting a little bit of like, versus that mother that doesn't want to be bothered with you. And it's often very sort of subtle. And that is one of its characteristics, is that it's not always so overt. It's the mother that gets her toddler or child up and always provides a nice breakfast. Do you want cereal? Do you want eggs? What do you want? Okay, here's your breakfast.
Well, there's no enjoyment.
Right. There's no enjoyment. There's no connection. And there is a deadness of affect and connection between mother and child that gives the child the message that I have a duty toward you. I feed you and I clothe you and I get you to your after-school lessons and your play dates, okay?
And when the deadness is also explained as the child's fault, that it is inferred or sometimes explicit that the reason you're being treated that way is that there is something wrong and unlovable about the child. And we see this frequently enough in our practice, that people come in with an underlying certainty that they are unlovable.
Right. And so this aspect of that comes out as not lovable, it's my fault, there's something wrong with me. I don't know what it is exactly, But I know it's me somehow. It
Mhm.
is definitely an aspect of a death mother that killed something off in the field or simply didn't have it to offer. And then where I'm headed after having touched on this is then what we do is we create what an author named Robert Firestone calls the fantasy bond. So that's a book. It'll be in the show notes. We have to create the illusion of connection. We have to, or we will not survive. We are highly social, relational, bonded creatures, and except in the presence of an annihilating mother that is physical as well as psychological and emotional, what we do is we create our own fantasy about how things work and where the relationship is. And then we can carry that into our adult life and fantasies about how closeness, intimacy, and relationship work that is largely created in our own self, projected onto other people as if it is an authentic, multidimensional, interpersonal bond, but it got created long, long ago as a result of relational trauma. That if I'm a really good kid and I'm a really good woman or man, and I do all these following things, then that's intimacy, that's connection, that's love. This is how I earn it. This is how I get it. And the list goes on and on.
So that conditional experience where the child might occasionally get a benign response, and then the child is unconsciously registering that with great intensity and trying to create the very tight little keyhole through which they have to fit to get a pat on the head, to get a benign look sometimes, which means so much of the child has to be pushed away in order to try to figure out the little tiny thing that might give them the bit. And then as an adult, all relationships can be seen that way. How do I need to constrict myself in order to get the hope of a little bit of something good? Now, when the death mother has totally possessed and I'm going to say possess the maternal field, because the archetype transcends the individual. So the archetype may be active in the mother's psyche, but it is in the energy of the household. And there can be multiple strange effects. But one of the devastating effects on the child is that it kills hope, that there is a sense of despair and hopelessness, and that death of hope then shows up in many, many different environments. The hope that one will do well at school, the hope that one will have a future. And the pernicious, quiet way that shows up in a child is this mantra. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What? I didn't get invited to the party in first grade. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Nothing matters, because if it matters, then you have hope. And if hope is going to be attacked by the death mother, it's best not to hope. That's a way of keeping yourself slick enough that there's no place for the death mother to go after you.
Hmm.
I liked your word a lot, Joseph, of constricting. And that is a great, maybe overall descriptor of what happens in a child is, the exuberance and the going out there and I have a question and can I have a sandwich, and versus all that energy having to be pulled back in and tamped down, and that only certain kinds of energy are allowed, like fitting yourself into that little keyhole, that performance is valued. Getting the lead in the school play is great. Making varsity, some sports team is great. All the things that are valued that become performative versus authentic expressions of self.
Right. It's like the child becomes a collapsing star. The vitality begins to crush into itself, and there are often strange somatic symptoms that the child will develop, which I think is captured in the story of Medusa, where it's not like she looks at people and they become neurotic, or she looks at people and then they develop some psychological symptom. That she looks at them and their bodies freeze, their bodies change, which is something that Marion Woodman really was interested in. And one of her areas of life work was the relationship between psyche and soma, and particularly how the mother affects the child's relationship to their own body, since she is the caregiver often of the body from in utero on until that independence happens. So if the death mother has this hope-killing hatred of her situation, the child's body registers that in very specific ways. So then you have children who refuse to eat and they're terribly underweight. Children that refuse to sleep because they're constantly vigilant in the bed and they can't let go.
Yeah. I'm going back to you referencing Medusa, Joseph, and that the mother that can't enjoy her children and delight in their funny, quirky exuberance and their pain in the neck behaviors. Medusa has her own story. You know what happened to that mother? The mother that some mother we may have brushed up against in personal life or even experienced. What happened there? Well, Medusa had been a very, very beautiful young woman, and she was raped by Poseidon in a temple of Athena. And who got blamed for that? Medusa. So Medusa's punishment was that she would be hideous and ugly and have her famous venomous snakes for hair. So this goes to who was your mother's mother and who was your mother's mother's mother. And so it goes in a great chain of emotional patterns that are multi-generational.
And Deb, I want to pick up on that and also bring back in your point about how we've split this, because I think that if you look at women who have actually committed infanticide, there is a way that I think they carry shadow for the whole society. Most of the time, the point that you made, Joseph, a woman who does something like that, is usually terribly under-resourced and under-supported and maybe suffering from some real mental health difficulties and isn't getting the help she needs. And so there's a way that there's a sort of sociological, psychological, and also an archetypal process going on. And I want to just bring in this really great book, and we'll put this in the book list as well. But it's a book about infanticide written by a psychologist who works as a forensic examiner for women who've killed their children. And the title of it is Uncovering the Act of Maternal Infanticide from a Psychological, Political, and Jungian Perspective. And it's by Brooke Laufer. And the book really kind of makes this point, right? That in some sense, we've split off this reality of this death mother energy. It's being held by often the poorest, most disenfranchised mothers, and it may get acted out in this way, and then it essentially someone like that winds up carrying collective shadow to a certain extent.
I also think that less physically threatening, that the death mother as a pattern was more visible, let's say, in American culture in the 1940s and 50s, in as much as women who didn't want to have babies were culturally pressured into having children, and in their hearts, knowing that this wasn't the trajectory that their own autonomous spirit wanted. And so then the pregnancy, all of the incredible challenges of raising children are foisted upon them. And there can be a pervasive feeling of, I didn't want this, I don't want it now, I didn't want it years ago, and that some power greater than me forced me into this situation. And that reaction can then cause this feeling towards the children. I didn't want you conceptually, and I don't want you now, and I'm putting up with this until you can get you out of the house. And I think that was more frequent when women did not have the autonomy and choice and support that they do now, at least again in Western cultures.
Yeah. I'm thinking about fairy tales. We've already talked about Hansel and Gretel a little bit, but if you think about it, filicide is such a common theme in fairy tales. Even some of the most common ones. There's Snow White, of course, whose mother is totally homicidal, going after her. Children are almost always in danger, and somehow they're being given away to witches, like in Rapunzel. And Little Red Riding Hood is swallowed by the wolf, who's sort of a stand-in for kind of parental figure. So it is a very common archetypal pattern that the child is endangered often by the mother. One of the fairy tales that comes to my mind is the juniper tree, which is an entirely spooky, Grimm's fairy tale, where there's a little boy and the mother has died, which is a very common setup, right? The good mother dies, and then there's a stepmother, and then we're in the realm. As soon as there's a stepmother, we're in the realm of the death mother. And she has a daughter of her own, and the two children become fast friends, the boy who's the stepson and then the little girl. But the mother doesn't like the little boy, and she winds up killing him and serving him to his father to eat. And then the little girl knows that this is the case, and she's bereft. And eventually the little boy is kind of reborn as a bird. The little girl gathers his bones and buries them underneath the juniper tree. And then there's this bird who kind of seeks revenge. But the fact that it's such a common theme in fairy tales tells us something about the archetypal power of this image, of this mythologem.
If you've ever seen an animal reject its child, it is very stunning and frightening. This is easy enough on YouTube, but just typing in, kind of a cow rejecting its calf or a doe rejecting its fawn, where the mothers will strike at the child and driving it away or trying to kill it. So, as we said, there is something in the ancient archetypal field that humans have, through the benefit of civilization and ethics and values, can sublimate or can contain, but is still absolutely there and affecting the mother subtly and sometimes overwhelming her to take dangerous actions.
Joseph, building on that, I'm going to read this little anecdote, which is quoted in this really great paper by Daniela Seif, and we'll link to the paper. And it's about an anthropologist who kind of recorded the life story of a Kung woman. I hope I'm saying that right. This woman's name was Nisa, and one of her earliest memories is of being on a gathering trip when her mother gave birth to an infant boy. And here's what Nisa said about the experience. After he was born, he lay there crying. I greeted him. Ho, ho, my baby brother. Ho, ho, I have a little brother. Someday we'll play together. But my mother said, what do you think this thing is? Why are you talking to it like that? Now get up and go back to the village and bring me my digging stick. I said, what are you going to dig? She said, a hole. The story. Ugh. I'm going to dig a hole so I can bury the baby. Then you, Nisa, will be able to nurse again. You're much too thin. Nisa recalls begging her mother not to kill the infant, and the baby was allowed to live. But she makes this point that was normal. Like if you were a mother in probably many pre-modern cultures, probably throughout history, and you had one child and you couldn't feed that child, and then you had another baby, maybe you felt like you had to kill that baby. Maybe you did have to kill that baby so the first child could live. So it's heartbreaking, but like you were saying, Joseph, it is part of the natural world, and it's part of our history.
Yeah, and it goes to what was being mentioned before about under-resourced women. And if you are a woman living in a tribal hunter-gatherer type of community, you have invested in that little girl that you just read about, Lisa.
Right.
There's a bond, care, food, all of it. And if there isn't enough to go around, it will be the infant with whom a bond has not yet really been established in time that will have to be sacrificed. Well, the corollary is women like, is it Andrea Yates? Did I get that right? Who killed her 5 children, was also under-resourced. She has 5 kids under 7, and if I'm remembering right, they were living in a trailer or something that was, not really optimum in the way of space and all the rest of it. And she was the sole caretaker for all 5 children all day, every day. Now, that's under-resourced in a different way. It's not literal food, but it's not enough in the way of support. And you can hypothesize, all of her psychological difficulties that were, just her own in addition to all this.
The story I just read really, really goes back to that idea about it being, there's no room for sentimentality.
Like when life and death have claimed the space, then the archetypes often activate in any number of different ways, not just the death mother, but any number of archetypes will come to the surface and then structure belief and behavior in a certain fashion. But I do want to try to take this primordial energy and give a sense of what this looks like in a less dramatic circumstance so it can be monitored. And because it's much, and this is where Danielle Lassif and Marion Woodman help us by trying to take this big, frightening archetype, this ancient goddess, and put her into a modern kitchen. Like, what does this look like when you're trying to make dinner and this energy surfaces? And what does it sound like? Because I think that's the place where, if we've encountered this, we're more likely to have brushed against it or been marred by it. So, a couple of ways that they help us understand this, that the mother who is possessed by the death mother experiences her children as a terrible burden, that they are a threat to her fragility, and they are a great burden. But because that the knowledge of that experience is disallowed, it creates a defensive reaction, and the mother finds herself constantly saying, I only want the best for you. I only want the best for you. And that's a defense against the more deep reality, which is, I don't want you here. I can't tolerate this. I never wanted this. So the subtext for a mother in that condition can be, I'm too scared, insecure, and compromised to allow you to live your life. So just feeling into that, it's tricky. I'm not enough. I don't have enough to allow you, my child, to live your life. So the child becomes a corrosive object to this kind of mother. And there is an energy to obliterate the actual child. Now, obliterating the child could be denying the needs of the child, being unable to even perceive what the child needs, to be affected by the child's needs. Another way that this can show up is that the mother preferences only the robust child, which is something that you would see, frankly, in the natural world. If you've ever had a dog that gave birth to puppies, if there's a weak puppy and it can't fight its way to a nipple, mommy dog doesn't really do anything about that.
Right.
So when this energy is strong, the mother may have 3 kids, but she's really only attentive to the one that looks like it's the strongest, most successful, most appealing of the children, and the others are somewhere else in the house. Again, not a conscious choice, but has a powerful effect on all the children, including the one who is over-preferenced, because that can also be very confusing. So there is a field of domination, ever-tightening rules, sometimes intrusive monitoring, and conditional affection. And that's all around this control masked as care.
You've just said a lot. That is very powerful to hear because it's so devastating.
It is. And it doesn't have to be big and loud and goddess-like. It can just be a pervasive field that everyone is living in. And again, to be compassionate, no mother wakes up and says, "Ooh, I can't wait to be the death mother." Like, that's not in anyone's agenda consciously. But these archetypal forces, bidden or unbidden, the goddess comes.
Yes. And that is so powerful that Jung had it inscribed over the front door to his house, that the God will be there. The archetypal realities will be there. And that the death mother is the mother who says, I don't have a lot. I have this much to give you. It's conditional upon your behavior and temperament and capabilities as a toddler, a baby, a 10-year-old. And we have to have a bond with our parents and other caretaking figures. So we try to sort of, suss that out and figure out what are the ways that we can be and feel appreciated, enjoyed, rewarded, attended to, and try to get some of that. Some kids rebel and won't do anything, but that we're talking about whether it is a person living in a hunter-gatherer type of community or a modern mother like Andrea Yates, of what are the resources, internal and external, available to that mother versus our sentimentalizing that mothers just love being moms all day, all the time, except for these ever so brief little lapses where I was testy or snapped out at my kid every night. But that's not really me. It's not true. We expect mothers today to do everything in a nuclear family, including hold down a job that pays you a salary.
Which can work well if one has enough inner and outer support, there are archetypes that can also awaken in a mother that allow her to be superhuman. And there are plenty of examples of superhuman moms that have full hearts, full careers, and are raising kids. So it's not that the death mother must appear. It's that there are certain conditions that compel her appearance. And there are other possibilities, which of course we also see. So every mother is not condemned to being the death mother.
I'm a little curious, a little sort of suspicious of these moms that are on YouTube and other things where, they make their own bread and they have some number of kids and their farm animals, and the list goes on of like
Demeter.
But I can't even imagine, even if I were a saint, getting up every morning at what time? 5 o'clock, 5:30, and going through the day and simply doing all those things. I can't imagine how there could be enough hours in the day. So that sort of feels one-sided to me, of the everything's coming up roses. Most of us really can't do everything all at once.
I understand. But there are other archetypes that are at play, is what I'm trying to say. And Demeter is an option to the death mother. And Demeter can support a different kind of experience as the mother. And is only one of many archetypes. And not everybody is going to be a child of Demeter. And I understand that for sure.
And the other flip side of Demeter is her daughter Persephone, who is innocent and is abducted by Hades and raped. So very seldom all one thing.
Undoubtedly.
And I think, Joseph, in terms of your desire to sort of, how does this look in a kitchen, and a little bit to the discussion that the two of you have just been having, there's a way that the death mother is always a potential in all of us, and I would say men as well, right? It is an archetypal energy, so it is universal. And even if we have a good enough mother, we still have to contend with the death mother, right? All of us, every single one of us has to contend with the death mother because it is a universal archetypal energy. And one of the examples, literary examples, where I think this comes across in a really interesting way is the Neil Gaiman book, Coraline. And it was also made into a really fantastic movie. So Coraline is this little girl who's kind of at odds with her family, and she's a little bit, I think they just moved, and she's sort of bored. And she has a mother who is sort of irritating, but like a good enough mother who gets a little irritated with her. But Coraline kind of goes through this doorway, if I recall, and goes into what winds up being sort of a mirror world. It looks a lot like her house, but it's a little bit different. And over there is the other mother. And the other mother is very sweet and solicitous and kind, although she has buttons for eyes. And at first, Coraline is like, well, this woman really appreciates me. But then quickly realizes that the other mother is there to ensnare her. And it's a very frightening, deliciously frightening story. But I kind of love the idea that there is always that other mother. Even when we have a good enough mother, there's an other mother lurking somewhere.
The movie is a wonderful teaching tool, I think, for kids, young people especially, adults as well. But in accomplishing that task of earlier years of toddlerhood and young childhood, of being able to integrate the positive and negative mother into one symbol. The, quote, real mother is distracted and pressured and all the rest of it. But Coraline realizes that's the real mother with her positive and negative attributes versus the saccharine, solicitous mother over there in the alternative world who is really deadly. So it's a wonderful story about accepting your real world mother and others, that they're not perfect. They can be irritating as all get out. And they also love you and have your best interest at heart, even though there are also all those other things. And where I'm going with this is, one way or another, we have to survive our childhoods. Not just physically, although that certainly counts, but it is incumbent upon us to truly find our authentic selves, our life, engage in whatever unfinished business, etc., may be left from our childhoods. The psychological and emotional and maturational and fullness that is imposed on many of us in today's world, that is not just physiological, is really huge, which of course goes to Jung's core concept of individuation. And it may be that there is a lot in our childhood to survive, but our mission is to be alive while we're alive. And that is a quest.
Yes, I think that Jung says in a number of places that by the time we are adults, blaming our parents or anybody else that raised us isn't fruitful, that whatever we're left with by the time we reach adulthood, now it is our own burden to sort out, to outgrow, to monitor. There's a last part. I know that we're kind of winding up, but I think it's important to mention because some who have been raised by individuals possessed by the death mother, that the death mother doesn't leave the children. And one of the very pernicious manifestations that needs to be acknowledged is that the children, some of them, will be on a slow march to an early death because the internalized agenda of the death mother still preys upon them. And I find that the death mother is often at the bottom of life-threatening addictions, and that the addiction and the obsession that's connected to the addiction is going to finally get the job done, that the death mother didn't complete since the person's reached adulthood.
The person has learned to substitute a substance for what is really truly needed and was missing.
I'm saying something else, that the death mother is telling the child to die, and the child's unconsciously enacting behaviors that will hasten their demise. Yes, there's a way to think about alcoholism as a comfort. I'm drunk, I'm warm, I'm fuzzy, and so that must be what it was like to be a well-loved child. But if we stay within the realm of the death mother, that the death mother is instructing the person from their own unconscious to finally succeed in the agenda, which is to stop being alive. So the womb and the tomb collapse into each other. And there is a march to that. And by recognizing the connection between our own life-annihilating addictions and this archetype, bring it into consciousness, that, as Jungians, that is the path of liberation. If we can hear the way the death mother is talking inside of us, we may be able to then be at a place of choice, which goes to what you were saying, Deb, which is, I think I'll choose life. I'll choose eros instead of thanatos.
Mm.
But in order to choose at the right level, we have to discover what is at play in that deeper strata and putting us at risk.
Absolutely. And I'll add another element to that, which is people who get into relationships that are unhealthy, abusive, destructive, all the things, which calls up the archetype of the demon lover. That if this is what you have learned, that a relationship is, and there are many facets and complications to it, that may be another way in which the life force heads into a kind of psychological destruction and death. This kind of relationship that is patently unhealthy, patently difficult. So we have talked about something important, something powerful, and that requires an astonishing amount of energy and more on the part of people that have experienced this.
Yeah, and I think the point that you've just both made about if you grew up with someone who was possessed by the Death Mother, how it can profoundly affect your health and your life, and getting to the root of it may require coming face to face with this fearsome archetype.
So this is a good time for us to soberly pivot into a dream. And for those who may be curious, Deb needed to step away, and so Lisa and I are going to field the dream today. Our dream is a 31-year-old male who is a writer and titles his dream Child Nuclear Meltdown, and here is his dream. I was touring a nuclear power plant with a group of people in the present day. During the tour, it comes out that I had actually designed the plant when I was 12, based off of the designs of the man who had designed the first ever nuclear power plant, but mine was a more modern take on this. Suddenly, the plant starts to have a meltdown. Water from the cooling tanks is rising quickly around us, and rivets are coming loose and firing off like bullets. We know we must evacuate the plant immediately. I begin feeling immense guilt that the failure of this structure that I was responsible for building was endangering others and the environment. But the others didn't seem to be thinking about that, and instead found it quite natural that a nuclear power plant designed by a 12-year-old would eventually melt down. I'm conflicted as to how I should feel about this, but at any rate, I enter an elevator that takes me to ground level, and once I am outside the plant, I wake up. For context, he writes, I will soon be moving out of Paris after living here for 4 years. I don't know where I will end up in the long term, or if maybe I will come back here eventually, but I know for the moment I need a change of environment and pace. Living in Paris and learning French were major aspirations of mine since I was very young, almost inexplicably. Now I've accomplished those aspirations and am wondering what's next. The main feelings in the dream are guilt, confusion, anger, loneliness, but also, strangely, calmness and support. And a sentence or two on associations. Nuclear power plant, he associates with rationality, structure, intelligence. Tour groups, he associates with collective, family, and friends. Meltdown, he associates with overwhelm, danger, and uncontrolled energy.
So I have a couple of sort of immediate thoughts, which is I'm struck by he said that that he from a very young age he knew he wanted to move to Paris and learn French, which is interesting. From a young age, he knew he wanted to do this, didn't know why, just something he had to do, and now he's kind of done it and it's coming apart. And so without being too pat or obvious, it's a little bit like this was a plan that was conceived presumably in childhood, that now he's lived it out, and it's its time is done. The rivets are old. It's all melting down. And so it could be sort of he had a life plan, and now that life plan is over. He's accomplished it, and now what comes next? And it feels like this sort of meltdown. And going a little bit deeper, one of my intuition sang as you were reading it, Joseph, and I wondered if this is a person, and of course this is purely conjecture, but I wondered if this is a person who was parentified as a child. There's something about the idea of a 12-year-old designing a nuclear power plant. I found myself thinking, what enormous responsibilities did this person possibly find on his shoulders as a very young person? It wasn't fair. Like, you wouldn't expect a 12-year-old to be able to design a nuclear power plant that wouldn't melt down, So just a little kind of question mark around that, which is maybe related. But in any case, I think what we can say is, and this is in the associations and it's in the dream, is whatever structure, design, plan he's had for his life, it's used up, and it's time for something new. And it feels like this transition is going to be potentially dangerous and destructive.
Frankly, I think you just nailed it. I think that's, I'm not sure they have much else to add, but I think you're right that there is the end of a cycle.
Yeah.
Has happened. He's experiencing that in terms of finishing up the fantasy of living in Paris. My first association when I was reading it is, are we talking about Paris, Tennessee or Paris, France? Very different experiences, undoubtedly, but Paris, France. And that he's really absorbed, feasted on the experience in a particular way. And now, what will be the guiding principle? Where is he going to get his life force to run the next stage of the show? And we don't know yet. And that usually is demonstrated in a kind of regression that often happens, so that he may have a kind of regressive depression, where the life force withdraws back into the unconscious, surrounds the next interesting seed idea, and lends aid and support to the next stage. But that deconstruction and reconstruction is something that happens, and the rising cooling tanks also remind me of the solutio. Something is dissolving, and that is in service to change, I would imagine.
Yeah, let's see. I was struck by his sense of guilt that he's, might be damaging other people and might be damaging the environment. He says immense guilt.
That leads to the parentified child piece, yeah.
Right, yes. And I'm struck by the fact that he's 12, right? That is a threshold age, really, between childhood and adolescence. I'm also struck by the image of meltdown, which of course is a word that has, we use colloquially to mean, as he said, overwhelmed, but also when we have an emotional meltdown, it's like, it's a big feeling. And finally, I want to say, and you touched on this, Joseph, that the good news here is he has had a nuclear power plant. That is a heck of a lot of energy that has driven his life forward. Now, as you said, it's kind of regressing. He's losing it all. It's all coming undone. But it's not going to go away. The energy doesn't get lost. It's going to go somewhere. It's going to go into the unconscious or somewhere. But it seems that this person has a tremendous amount of just innate life energy, just innate libido, just because of this image of a nuclear power plant. And there is a sense of calm, like the other people in the dream are like, this happens.
Yeah, 12-year-old fantasies, they run their course. Nothing unusual around here. But I want to focus on the word touring, because he's been a tourist in Paris for several years. You think you're just a tourist in your life in Paris, and then you find out, wait a minute, I'm not just a tourist in my life. I've actually structured all of this myself.
That's great.
That's another interesting attitude. And we can feel very provisional. One way of describing the provisional life is like, I'm a tourist. I'm an eternal tourist. And it sounds like coming back from several years living abroad, there's an opportunity to get your feet on the ground, to transition from being a tourist to being a homeowner, perhaps, or putting down roots in a place that is stable, not transitional, and that one's life at a certain point has to be taken in hand as the main project, not something that we're just visiting, so to speak. I think it's a great dream, actually. I think it's intense, undoubtedly. And I can also understand that if we'd used a naturalistic lens, a nuclear power plant falling apart is a life-threateningly dangerous event that can blight a city, so to speak, like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. So I understand the level of alarm that one might feel. So it's interesting that the other tourists are more relaxed about it because the repercussions could be massive.
Yeah. But the dream ego, if we go with the maxim that the least trustworthy attitude in the dream is that of the dream ego, the dream ego is very activated by it. Everyone else is like, it happens. I like what you said, Joseph, about him realizing that he's designed this whole thing. I really like that because it is, when we're adults, we sort of realize, oh, if we're lucky, we realize that we are the architect of our own fate. Which gives us agency because we can make different choices going forward.
And I think this conflict about how I should feel about this, and then this idea of guilt. Should I feel guilty that my plans that I made at 12 years old have come to a conclusion? And what I would say is, thank goodness, because I'm not sure that anybody at 12 years old has enough foresight to chart an entire life going forward. But if your inner 12-year-old has been given a really fun couple of years in Paris, France, good on you. I mean, that sounds like a blast. And at 31, which is also kind of a transitional stage as we're moving towards, but probably not at midlife, yes, the agendas of the child do get put away, and something more sober, something more grave, so to speak, often takes up residence for the second half of life.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.